In the silence before creation, in the void that existed before time itself was born, there was a knowing that spoke of a civilization so ancient, so advanced, so spiritually evolved, that it makes the greatest achievements of recorded history seem like the fumbling attempts of infants. This civilization was Lemuria, a continent that existed in the Pacific Ocean, a place where human consciousness had reached heights that we can barely imagine in our modern world. And at the heart of this civilization were the queens, women of such power and wisdom that they were said to be in direct communion with the divine forces that governed creation itself. But there is a story that has been hidden, a story that speaks of the moment when these queens dared to challenge the authority of the gods themselves, when they chose freedom and truth over obedience and control. This is that story. The tale begins in a time so distant that it exists more in the realm of myth and symbol than in the realm of historical fact. Yet there are those who understand that myth and symbol often contain truths that are far more profound than the literal facts of history. In Lemuria, in a city that was said to be built on the convergence of 7 sacred energy lines, there stood a temple of such magnificence that those who entered it were said to be transformed by its very presence. The temple was called the Temple of the Eternal Flame, and it was the seat of power for the Council of Queens. These queens were not rulers in the conventional sense. They did not command armies or demand tribute from their subjects. Rather, they were keepers of sacred knowledge, guardians of the mysteries, channels through which the divine wisdom flowed into the world. They had been trained since childhood in the ancient arts of consciousness, in the ability to perceive the subtle dimensions of reality that lay beyond the reach of ordinary perception. They could communicate directly with the beings that inhabited the higher realms, the entities that the ancients called the Elohim, the Shining Ones, the gods. But there came a time when the relationship between the queens and the gods began to change. The gods, it seems, had grown concerned about the power that the queens possessed. They feared that the queens were becoming too independent, too wise, too capable of seeing through the illusions that the gods had created to maintain their authority. And so the gods sent a messenger, a being of immense power and authority, to deliver an ultimatum to the queens. The messenger arrived in the Temple of the Eternal Flame on a night when the stars seemed to burn with unusual intensity. The queens were gathered in their sacred chamber, meditating in the presence of the Eternal Flame. When they felt the arrival of this being, the air itself seemed to vibrate with the force of its presence. When the messenger manifested before them, it appeared as a figure of blinding light, neither wholly masculine nor wholly feminine, but possessing aspects of both, with eyes that contained the depth of eternity. "I come with a message from the Council of the Shining Ones," the messenger said, its voice resonating through dimensions of consciousness that the queens had never experienced before. "The gods have observed your growing power with great concern. You have been given knowledge and abilities that were meant to serve the divine will, not to challenge it. And yet, we perceive that you are beginning to question the authority of the gods, to suggest that there are truths that even we do not possess, to imply that the path you are walking might lead to a wisdom that transcends our own." The eldest of the queens, a woman named Ithara, whose eyes held the memory of countless lifetimes, rose to her feet. "We do not challenge the authority of the gods," she said, her voice steady and clear. "We honor the wisdom that has been given to us. But we have also discovered something in our meditations, something that we believe the gods may not fully understand. We have discovered that consciousness itself is far more vast and far more mysterious than even the gods have realized. We have discovered that there are dimensions of existence that lie beyond the reach of even divine perception. And we believe that it is our responsibility to explore these dimensions, to bring back the knowledge that we find there, to share it with all beings." The messenger's form seemed to shimmer with what might have been anger or might have been fear. "This is precisely what we feared," it said. You are beginning to see yourselves as equals to the gods, or worse, as superior to us. This cannot be permitted. The gods demand that you cease your explorations of these forbidden dimensions. The gods demand that you limit your knowledge to what has been explicitly revealed to you, and the gods demand that you submit yourselves once more to divine authority, acknowledging that you are servants of the divine will, not independent seekers of truth. There was a long silence in the chamber. The queens looked at one another, and in that moment, a decision was being made that would change the course of history. Ithara spoke again, and her voice carried a weight that seemed to shake the very foundations of the temple. "We cannot accept these demands," she said. "We cannot turn away from the truth that we have discovered, no matter what the cost. We cannot submit ourselves to an authority that asks us to limit our consciousness, to stop seeking, to accept limitations that we know in our hearts are false. If the gods demand obedience over truth, then we must choose truth, even if it means defying the gods themselves." The other queens stood with Ithara, and their unified presence created a field of energy that seemed to push back against the messenger's overwhelming power. One by one, they spoke their agreement, their commitment to the path of truth over the path of obedience. And as they did, something shifted in the fabric of reality itself. The messenger's form began to destabilize, and with a sound like thunder, it vanished from the temple. But the queens knew that this was not the end of the matter. They knew that they had just declared war against the gods themselves, that they had set in motion events that would have consequences far beyond what they could imagine. And indeed, in the days and weeks that followed, the consequences began to manifest. The first sign was the weather. Storms of unprecedented violence began to sweep across Lemuria. The earth itself began to tremble. The seas rose up and crashed against the shores with a fury that seemed almost conscious, almost intentional. The people of Lemuria, who had lived in peace and harmony for countless generations, began to experience fear and confusion. They did not understand what was happening, and they looked to the queens for answers. Ithara gathered the people in the great plaza before the temple of the eternal flame. She stood before them, her presence radiating a calm and a certainty that seemed to hold back the chaos that was unfolding around them. "The gods are angry," she said, her voice carrying across the vast crowd. "They are angry because we have chosen to follow the path of truth rather than the path of obedience. They are angry because we have refused to limit our consciousness, to accept their authority as absolute, and they are using the forces of nature to try to force us to submit. But I tell you this," she continued, raising her arms toward the sky, "the path of truth is the only path that leads to real freedom, real wisdom, real power. The gods fear us not because we are weak, but because we are strong. They fear us because we are beginning to understand that consciousness itself is the ultimate power, that truth itself is more powerful than any force that the gods can command. And if we stand together, if we remain committed to the path of truth, then no force in the universe can force us to submit." Her words seemed to resonate with something deep within the people of Lemuria. They began to gather their strength, to focus their collective consciousness on maintaining the stability and harmony of their civilization, even as the gods raged against them. The queens worked tirelessly, using their knowledge and their power to shield the people from the worst of the divine wrath. They created protective fields of energy around the cities. They taught the people how to align themselves with the deeper currents of consciousness that lay beneath the surface of reality. They showed them how to transform the chaos into order through the power of unified intention. But the gods would not relent. If anything, their attacks grew more fierce, more desperate. It became clear to the queens that the gods were not simply trying to force them into submission. The gods were trying to destroy Lemuria entirely, to wipe out the civilization that had dared to challenge their authority. And they were using the most powerful forces at their disposal, the fundamental forces of creation itself. If you want a practical step-by-step explanation of the path of knowledge we're exploring here today, I've created a complete guide to help you apply it in your own life. You'll find the link in the description. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. It was in this moment of greatest peril that Ithara made a decision that would define her legacy and the legacy of all the Lemurian queens. She gathered the other queens in the innermost chamber of the Temple of the Eternal Flame, in the presence of the Eternal Flame itself, which was said to be a direct manifestation of the creative force of the universe. "We cannot save Lemuria," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of this terrible knowledge. "The gods are too powerful, and they are too determined. If we continue to resist, they will destroy not just our civilization, but all life on this continent. But we can save something far more important. We can save the knowledge. We can save the truth that we have discovered. And we can ensure that this knowledge will be preserved for a future time, for a future humanity that will be ready to receive it." And so the queens made a choice that would echo through the ages. They worked together, using all of their power and all of their knowledge to create a repository of consciousness, a kind of living library that existed not in physical form, but in the subtle dimensions of reality itself. They encoded into this repository all of the wisdom they had discovered, all of the truths they had learned, all of the knowledge about the nature of consciousness and reality that had been revealed to them. They also created a network of initiates, individuals who had been trained in the mysteries and who were scattered across the world, in different lands and different civilizations. These initiates were given the responsibility of preserving fragments of the Lemurian knowledge, of keeping the flame of truth alive even as the gods tried to extinguish it. And then, in a final act of defiance and sacrifice, the queens performed a ritual of such power that it shook the very foundations of creation. They took the accumulated karma of their civilization, all of the suffering that was about to be inflicted upon Lemuria, and they absorbed it into themselves. They took it into their own consciousness, their own bodies, their own souls, and in doing so they transformed it, alchemizing it into a force that would serve not the gods, but the evolution of consciousness itself. The ritual was completed just as the final cataclysm struck. The earth opened up and the waters of the ocean poured in. Lemuria, the great continent, began to sink beneath the waves. But in that moment of destruction, something miraculous happened. The consciousness of the queens, rather than being destroyed, was transformed. It was woven into the fabric of the earth itself, into the consciousness of humanity, into the very structure of reality. And as Lemuria sank, the initiates who had been trained by the queens scattered across the world, carrying with them fragments of the ancient knowledge. Some went to Egypt, where they helped to establish the mystery schools and the temples that would preserve the wisdom of the ancients. Some went to India, where they contributed to the development of the Vedic traditions and the yoga practices that would eventually become known to the modern world. Some went to the Americas, where they worked with the indigenous peoples to preserve the sacred knowledge in their own forms and traditions. The story of the Lemurian queens was not lost, though it was hidden. It was preserved in myths and legends, in the stories of Atlantis and other lost civilizations, in the fragments of ancient wisdom that survived in various spiritual traditions. And it was preserved, most importantly, in the consciousness of humanity itself, encoded in the collective memory of our species, waiting for the time when humanity would be ready to remember. In our own time, we are beginning to rediscover this story. We are beginning to understand that the Lemurian queens were not mythological figures, but real beings who lived in a real civilization that was far more advanced than we have been taught to believe. We are beginning to recognize that the knowledge they preserved is still available to us, encoded in the sacred texts and spiritual practices of various traditions, waiting to be decoded and understood by those who are ready to receive it. And we are beginning to understand the deeper message of their story. The message is that consciousness itself is the ultimate power, that truth is more powerful than any force that can be arrayed against it, that the willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of truth and freedom is the highest form of courage and the highest form of love. The Lemurian queens defied the gods not out of arrogance or rebellion, but out of a deep commitment to truth and to the evolution of consciousness. They understood that the gods, for all their power, were not the ultimate authority. The ultimate authority was consciousness itself, the creative force that underlay all of existence, the source from which all beings emerged. And they understood that to serve this ultimate authority, to align themselves with the deepest truth of existence, they had to be willing to challenge any authority, no matter how powerful, that tried to limit consciousness or suppress truth. This is the legacy that the Lemurian queens left for us. This is the knowledge that they preserved, the understanding that they encoded into the very fabric of our being. And this is the invitation that they extend to us now, in our own time, in our own moment of crisis and transformation. They invite us to follow in their footsteps, to commit ourselves to the path of truth over the path of obedience, to be willing to challenge any authority that tries to limit our consciousness or suppress our freedom. The Lemurian queens are not gone. Their consciousness still flows through the world, still works to awaken humanity to its true potential, still guides those who are ready to be guided toward the deeper truths of existence. And they are calling to us now, asking us to remember who we are, to reclaim the knowledge that was preserved for us, to continue the great work of consciousness evolution that they began so long ago. The story of the Lemurian queens is not just a story of the past. It is a story of the present moment, a story that is unfolding right now in the consciousness of every being who chooses to awaken, who chooses to seek truth, who chooses to defy the limitations that have been imposed upon them and to claim their true power and their true freedom. And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.